So it's good to be able to get up after the lunch. You're all welcome to do that just for a second, maybe. While we're transitioning, oh, that was fast. For those of you who have come from abroad, maybe how many of you found, I don't have a clicker to do a vote, but how many of you found Bangalore to be warmer than expected for February? Yeah. So I have good news for you, it's not global warming. It turns out, as I've learned when I came to Bangalore, that the summer starts in February and ends by April-ish. By May, it starts to cool down in Bangalore. Completely surprising and counterintuitive. So that leads me to the first sort of recognition for smart systems, that every little place or every country, every utility is going to be a little bit different. So coming to the talk, I think it's great. We've seen transmission and utilities. I want to also do a little bit of bottom-up, which is the consumers. But obviously, I'm not going to talk about consumers only, but put consumers in the context of utilities and discoms. Now, it's really because it's a systems approach to emphasize what Masood Amin had pointed out in the morning. And the systems approach really leads one to also understand. When we say, for example, we heard that microgrids or off-grid is the solution, in different places very differently. So one observation looking at India is that the grid already reaches 95% of the villages. It's a last mile problem that India has, unlike parts of Africa where the grid isn't there. And so that has different implications. So what type of microgrid will make sense? And if I look at renewable technologies, other than solar, whether it's biomass, microhydel, or especially wind, these are bigger than a village. In fact, wind is megawatt class in terms of efficiency. So those are different implications for what you may need to do. And if you say solar, then the peak demand, especially in a household level in villages, or in fact households across India, all India, is in the evening, because it's lighting driven or residential timings driven, including air conditioning if you're in Delhi. And so the evening requires a battery if you're on solar. So we will see evolution of all of these through shifts in demand and consumers. So in the old little grid, some of these are well known to this audience, but I'll just skim through some of them. And I wanted to go beyond just the basics, but also add an Indian lens to some of the details. So in the older grid, we had to always have enough supply to meet variable demand. Some would call it over-engineering. And utility engineers were viewed as some of the most conservative people after air traffic controllers. In a smart grid, now, and not just smart, but even without the smarts per se, as you get more renewables, you're getting more supply variability. So now one of the answers people talk about is, can we also have demand be controlled variable to match or to help keep things in equilibrium? With, of course, now storage coming up in a large scale. Now, one of the fundamental questions, this comes to the utility death spiral that Prince Moyo talked about, is really, here's a question to anyone talking of rooftop solar today. I talk to tech companies saying, I'm putting up a 30 megawatt solar plant. Now, whether that's for green reasons or is it economic reasons, here's the question to them. Are you still using the grid? And invariably the answer is yes. So now your grid has become your new battery, at least until we get them to have their own batteries. So that's another part of this business model challenge. How do we price that in? In most places in the world, that hasn't been figured out yet. So you all know what the utility death spiral is through technologies and so forth. But in India, what we find is you have other drivers that can shift change, including leakage and tiered slabs. Like California and some other places, your tariff, your retail prices depend on how much you consume. They go up, and you have cross subsidies between segments of consumer, which also happens in other parts of the world. So now it is exactly these paying customers, so-called C&I, commercial and industrial users, who are the first likely to exit the grid, whether it's through storage, smart grids, demand response, rooftop solar, not even rooftop. In India, most solar is grid scale. It's not rooftop. It's grid scale, little bit typically outside the cities, but interconnected back into the grid. And the incentive structures being set up, at least right now, are such that they will get waivers of some of the charges that other generators would have if industry did their own captive generation. That's an incentive to renewables, but it is still a cost that needs to be socialized. So consumers. Bank robber Willie Sutton was asked, why do you rob banks? Well, that's where the money is. So where's the money in an electricity system? It's the consumers. They're the ones who are supposed to pay for this. Except, of course, you can have governments paying, or once in a while you get these technology bubbles and then you find investors are paying for things, but usually that doesn't last very long. So what are consumers paying for? Is it electricity? A number of scholars are now recognizing they're not only paying for electricity, you are now paying for the option of having electricity, which means I have, for example, a connected load for my apartment of 3 or 5 kilowatts. I'm rarely using the full connected load, but I have that option, and the utility must plan, at least with some statistical multiplexing, to serve a certain quantum of energy whenever I may ask for it. So that is the real cost to a modern sort of grid. The other thing that has happened historically, and I'm building on an analogy by Peter Fox-Penner from Brattle, we're today, or historically, have sold electricity like a basket of fruit. Rupees per kilo, rupees per kilowatt hour, 5 rupees. Now that basket includes mangoes, lychees, oranges, bananas. So you have different times of day, different location, different sources, different cleanliness, environmental impacts, import, foreign exchange implications, but we blend it together. What that does is it masks the marginal cost incentive, which is really what we need to be propagating to consumers. And not just consumers, even utilities. Today in India, most discoms, distribution companies, operate on average cost accounting. So when I asked a utility MD, how much will you save by putting up a rooftop solar panel or smart grid something per rupee, per kilowatt hour? They quote a number 3, 3.5, 4, which is their average cost of power. But at the margin, you could be saving far more if you're paying for example, peak power or frequency surcharges that were there in the past. So if we look at smart grid and all the components that are there, I won't go into the detail. The consumer demand linked to metering and the households really fits into the middle. So these are data from one of my students from 1980 from New England, 10 to the 4, so that's about, this is a histogram of load. So the peak was about 15,000 megawatts in New England and 1980. And the peak 30 hours all the way to 500 hours was relatively tight a tail. But as time progressed, as you would expect, the average shifted, the total demand grew. But more importantly than the total demand growing is that the tail got much, much wider and fatter. So this is, it's about 26 years, you can see this spread. And we have limited data, and I'm trying to capture more granular data with India. We have it for Delhi and some other places we've seen where more data is available. The peak is growing faster than the average, and that has very profound implications for your grid design. So here's the thing about consumers and participation. I'm going to be first I'll mention something partially as a joke. India has the most effective grid balancing system in the world. Too bad it's not voluntary. Load shedding or brownouts. And so we want to balance in a smarter manner, whether it's through supply management, but more than that, I believe, demand management. Now, here is why I'm optimistic that developing regions are where ultimately smart systems have a very bright future, unlike the US. And it's because in developing regions, people don't take power for granted. In the US, you tell someone, well, we're putting up smart systems, you modify your peak to off-peak, maybe you'll save a couple of dollars per month. So I've called that the slice of pizza syndrome. People may be even interested, but then studies have found in the US, after being more aware and engaged in a couple of months, then their engagement level starts to come down. In India, you tell people that you do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and you could save 30 rupees a month, they're interested. Or you tell them you'll have zero load shedding. Now they're very interested. So how do we do that? It's through a smarter system with differential pricing or differential quality of supply. I believe a lot more people will jump for it. So what would differential pricing look like for consumers? You've got time of day at one end, all the way to real time at another. I don't think consumers want real-time pricing at the small level, because no one's going to go stare at a in-home display or go look at web updates saying turn on or off for things. This will change when we get automation. and simplicity. So in addition to automation and simplicity, the American Association of Home Appliance Manufacturers has a very nice white paper which also says we need consumers to be in charge and we need incentives, meaning pricing differentials. Otherwise, why would I ever bother as a consumer shifting or changing my lifestyle, my comfort, and so forth? How else would a consumer participate? It could include demand response, which is more like a dynamic DSM measure, demand side management. Storage, including electric vehicles, and I'll come to that in a second. Or self-generation, which could be rooftop. So now you become a producer consumer. Rooftop solar is just one of the talked about examples. But in countries other than India where heating is a need, combined heat and power is a no-brainer. You look at certain Western European countries, Netherlands, for example, very large fraction of the total power is actually distributed because there's combined heat and power. So we should synergize these. A lot of talk about prosumer has been you put a rooftop solar on your grid. Well, that's not the only way a consumer can participate. The simplest thing is actually managing when they consume. If I cut down my consumption to a utility, it looks relatively similar compared to me feeding in the same kilowatt hour into the grid. And cutting down my consumer actually could be cheaper than producing it as an end user. So we have to enable all forms, whether it happened to be a rooftop solar or it was local storage, peak shifting, smart systems. We have to enable all of them. And consumers also have to be cautious because we cannot conflate retail tariffs with generation costs. So if I'm a tech company putting a 30 megawatt solar park and my electricity tariff as a commercial user is 9 rupees a kilowatt hour, well, solar already starts to look very, very attractive, but that's not an apples to apples comparison. Storage doesn't just mean batteries, which is what you call the holy grail, but it's also usage shift, time, thermal. You can preheat your water heaters, you can pre-chill, pre-cool. Vehicle to grid is an inevitability. But experience from the rest of the world has pointed out energy arbitrage is not the only benefit of storage systems or even smart systems. It's actually for ancillary services or other things where demand is actually now providing a lot of these support mechanisms for the grid. It's not time of day energy arbitrage necessarily, or in the Indian case, seasonal arbitrage is what you need. Wind, for example, in India, especially in the coastal southern states, which are the leaders, heavily seasonal. In a couple of months, you get 80% of your generation with wind, the monsoon season, the windy season. So how do we enable more consumer participation? Well, obviously, a smart grid is one way, and smart grids have to make sense economically. But let's now think about a synergy with smart homes and smart cities. So that's where people get excited when we have co-benefits like convenience, safety, or choice. If we look at who is the bulk consumer, not number of consumers, but kilowatt hours, that upper 25% is the vast majority of consumption. For the top, even in India, top 10% of the population, they're less worried about whether the electricity tariff went up 5-10%. They'd rather get quality, comfort, control, and maybe even convenience. Smartphones are ubiquitous, or at least growing in cities in India, where people would want to be able to turn on or off air conditioning on the fly, or have it pre-cool so that when they get home, half an hour early, it turns on. There's a lot of challenges we need to figure out how to make it work. Security, cybersecurity, of which privacy is just one small example. There's a nice acronym one of the thinkers in this space talks about. When Internet of Things, smart. He's worried, is that just surveillance marketed as revolutionary technology? Because think about it. How many of you have a smart TV at home?
I think everyone has.
Have you read the fine print in the smart TV? The ones that can do voice recognition? It's always listening to what you're saying so that it can convert those signals. So it says, please do not say anything sensitive in front of the TV because this is transmitted to third parties for transcription, for automated conversion.
We need to wrap up.
Yeah, last slide. And I think the last thing we really need, and our keynote in the morning talked about this, regulatory simplicity. The regulatory and business models is really why the next Utility 2.0 hasn't taken off. So we want it so simple that anybody can participate based on, of course, technical and safety criteria. We shouldn't require special licensing. If I am a prosumer, I shouldn't need a license as a generator, whether it's through as a virtual power plant or a physical power plant with solar of a certain scale. We also need the flip side, which is utilities to be ready to handle these inputs and to give permissions in time. Today, when someone signs up saying, I want a rooftop solar with a feed-in, utilities can take weeks, if not months, to actually get their legwork done and give the approvals. So the future will change, because we started with unbundling, as one of the first shifts. Then we had competition all the way now down to the retail level in some countries. Now we have an impending Uberization. Now, this term has different connotations in different parts of the world. In Paris, they're on strike to stop these taxis. But I'm not talking about the disruption that comes from bypassing regulation. I'm talking about the disruption that comes from innovation at the edge, where you get new platforms, new technologies, where you don't need the central core's permission to actually participate into a system. Thank you.